Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. I fell asleep on the couch at my mother's house with the television on. I put my cell phone under the pillow, right under my head. I don't know how much time passed, but at some point, I felt the phone vibrate as if it was receiving a call. When I looked, I saw that the call was from someone named Peanut. Half groggy, I answered, "Hello." On the other end of the line, I heard my father. There was static in the sound, but it was unmistakably his voice. He said, "Hey," with that tone of his, as if he was surprised that it had worked, almost like, "Wow, it worked." I responded, "My God, hi." He continued, "My phone isn't working right, or maybe I couldn't figure out how to use it." It seems that's why he called from a phone marked as Peanut. He added, "I'm trying to call everyone. I just wanted to say that I love you and that I'm safe." After that, he mentioned that he was in room 4 and said a 3-digit number that began with 4. I responded, saying that I loved him too, that I was happy to know he was well, and asked him to repeat the room number because I couldn't understand. He reaffirmed, "I love you too. I'm safe," but once again, the combination of static and the loud sound of the TV in the dream made it impossible to understand the numbers clearly. I finalized, "I love you too, Dad." I don't remember how the call ended, but when I woke up, I was still exactly where I had fallen asleep. For a moment I was perplexed, thinking, what was that? Some details stay with me. He sounded a bit like when he was sick, but seemed slightly improved. I also remember that I was watching a late-night talk show before falling asleep, and on the channel, one of those loud infomercials had started. This same infomercial was playing on the TV when I woke up, exactly as in the dream. Curiously, no one in my family has any idea who this Peanut might be. The thing is, my father passed away 3 years ago after a prolonged battle with cancer. In his final weeks, he was in hospice care, heavily medicated and often confused. We never got to say a proper goodbye. He slipped into a coma and died 2 days later. What makes this dream so unsettling is how different it was from my usual dreams about Dad. Normally, when I dream of him, we're in familiar places, fishing at the lake where we spent summers, or sitting in his workshop while he tinkered with old radios. This felt more like an actual phone call that somehow crossed planes of existence. I've looked through his old contacts, his notebooks, even asked his old colleagues if they knew anyone he called Peanut. Nothing. There's no record of that nickname anywhere in his life. Last month, I visited the hospice where he spent his final days, curious about the room number he mentioned. While the facility had been renovated since his stay, I discovered that the old room numbering system did indeed start room designations with the number 4 on the floor where he had been. The staff couldn't confirm his exact room number from 3 years ago, but the nurse who remembered him thought it might have been 412 or 417. I don't consider myself particularly spiritual, and I've always been skeptical about afterlife communications. But this experience has left me questioning everything I thought I knew. Sometimes I place my phone under my pillow before sleeping, half hoping, half fearing it might happen again. Was it truly just a dream? My subconscious creating a scenario where I got the closure I never had? Or was it something more? A brief connection across whatever divides separate us from those we've lost. I don't have answers, just the lingering warmth of hearing my father's voice one more time, telling me he's safe. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My mother and I decided to camp in an isolated area of the forests in northern Maine. Upon arrival, we realized we were the only people around, which was already somewhat uncomfortable. At first, everything seemed normal until our tent was taken over by a spider infestation. With no alternative, we went to sleep in the car. It was the middle of the night, between 2:30 and 3 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, overcome by an almost paranoid restlessness, feeling that something or someone might be watching us from among the trees. Then, looking through the left rear window, something left me in shock. A large portal began to form. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. To make sure I was awake, I pinched myself and even gave myself a few slaps. The pain confirmed it was real. The portal, with bluish tones with greenish traces, was getting larger and larger, reaching about 6 to 8 feet in height. The scene reminded me of something that came directly out of a sci-fi movie. Without delay, I woke my mother to confirm what I was seeing. She looked and frightened, reacted quietly, "Don't move. Stay silent." From inside the portal, a humanoid figure appeared, holding a lantern. The man looked around and then made a gesture, calling other people. 5 or 6 figures came out in sequence. They wore clothes that resembled Amish or Mennonite attire, and also carried lanterns. They gathered for a few moments, as if they were talking, and soon followed in single file into the forest. The first man, who seemed to be the leader, returned to the portal, disappearing soon after he entered. As soon as the portal closed, we observed the lights of the lanterns gradually fade as the figures entered the darkness of the woods. My mother, still without saying a word, started the car, and we left in complete silence. We remained that way during the entire long journey back to Massachusetts. After this experience, both my mother and I became fervent believers in paranormal phenomena and the existence of extraterrestrials. To this day, I wonder if anyone has witnessed something similar because, although it seems absurd, I can swear that all this really happened. I've spent the last 5 years trying to make sense of what we saw that night. At first, I was consumed by it, spending countless hours researching portals, interdimensional travel, and alien encounters. I joined online forums, attended UFO conventions, even revisited the campsite twice during daylight hours with friends. Nothing ever came close to explaining what we witnessed. The locals had no stories of similar occurrences, though an elderly man at a nearby general store did mention that the area had been used for some government testing in the 60s, without elaborating further. My mother and I have discussed that night hundreds of times, comparing our memories to ensure we weren't somehow collectively hallucinating. Our stories have remained consistent. The only detail we disagree on is the number of figures. I counted 6, while she insists there were 7. 3 years after the incident, something strange happened. I was browsing a history book about early colonial settlements in Maine, when I came across an illustration that stopped my heart. It depicted a group of early Shaker settlers in the exact attire we had seen that night, down to the distinctive lanterns they carried. The book dated the illustration to 1819, over 2 centuries ago. Were they time travelers, ghosts, beings from another dimension wearing forms we could comprehend? I still don't know, but I'm certain of one thing. What we saw was real, and it fundamentally changed how I understand reality. My mother passed away last winter. In her final days, as clarity sometimes comes to the dying, she spoke of the portal again. "They weren't coming through," she whispered, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. "They were going home, and someday so will we." She died peacefully that night, leaving me with yet another mystery from that strange evening in the Maine wilderness. In the time she was still among us, we made a peculiar promise. If one day one of us departed, the other would be haunted. It wasn't just a joke or bravado. We both truly believed in life after death and in spirits. Although there was a playful tone about how this haunting would happen, I remember we only mentioned it a couple of times. It's been 3 years since my wife passed away. I still remember the exact moment. I was in the room where she took her last breath. The machines were still breathing for her, but I felt when her presence vanished. It was as if her soul simply abandoned the body, while the monitors continued to emit their sounds. A few hours later, the devices were turned off. To give a bit more context, my wife had been battling a rare autoimmune disorder, and this fight had profoundly worn out her organs and intestines. It was a painful and slow process. When I say I felt her departure, it was like something instantaneous, fast, almost like the firing of a bullet. In life, our coexistence was harmonious. We didn't shout at each other. There were never insults, and our disagreements were rare and always resolved calmly. I knew that her condition had caused a lot of damage, but I never understood the true extent of it. It was only after her death that I found evidence on her phone. I discovered that she had known years before me that her condition would end up being fatal. Even so, she kept this a secret, while I made plans for us to grow old together. Since then, I hadn't heard or felt her presence in a concrete way. Now, fast forward 3 years, and I find myself alone in the kitchen, lost in thoughts about her. A wave of deep sadness invaded me, and then, for the first time, I was overcome by anger. I shouted, "You did this to me, and you did this to yourself. Now it's me who has to deal with this. I hate what you did to me." The instant after, a voice echoed clearly in my head from side to side, as if she were there, alive, right beside me. Well, it was about time. I felt as if a swarm of tingles ran through my mind. I don't need to say that I cried with an intensity I hadn't felt in 3 years. It was the deepest cry since the day she died. The unexpectedness of her response was so perfectly her. That slight edge of teasing sarcasm she always had, especially when I was being dramatic. For a moment, it felt like one of our normal conversations, as if death had never separated us at all. I stood there in our kitchen, the kitchen we had designed together with its pale blue walls, and the ridiculous rooster-themed daycare she had insisted on, and I laughed through my tears. Because, of course, she would choose that moment to fulfill our pact. Not during the funeral when I was drowning in grief. Not on our anniversary when I sat alone at our favorite restaurant. But on a random Tuesday evening when I finally allowed myself to feel angry with her. That was her way, never predictable, always with perfect timing. Since that day, I haven't heard her voice again, at least not with that same clarity. But I feel her presence more often now, usually when I least expect it. A whiff of her perfume while I'm reading in bed. The sensation of someone sitting on the edge of the mattress when I'm half asleep. The feeling of fingers brushing against my shoulder as I wash dishes at the sink. I've found strange little gifts, too. A single earring she lost years ago, suddenly appearing on my nightstand. Her favorite mug, which I was certain had broken during the move to the smaller apartment, mysteriously back in the cupboard one morning. Our friends think I'm still deep in the grieving process, finding meaning in coincidences as a way to keep her close. Maybe they're right. Or maybe she's keeping her promise in her own subtle way, reminding me that whatever comes after this life, love somehow remains. I've started talking to her out loud again. Not constantly, not desperately, but comfortably. The way you might chat with a longtime roommate while moving through your day. I tell her about small victories at work, complain about the neighbor's loud music, ask her opinion on whether I should get a dog. And sometimes, in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, I swear I hear her answer. It was a few years ago. I was awakened on a Sunday morning by the phone ringing. It was a little girl, perhaps about 4 years old. "Good morning, Grandpa." I let out a laugh, finding her voice sweet, and explained with gentleness that she had dialed the wrong number. "Oh," she responded, hanging up right after. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. "Good morning, Grandpa." I laughed once more, and with patience, tried to say that she had made the same mistake. "Are you coming, Grandpa? What time will you arrive?" "Hurry up, we're about to start." Her excitement was contagious. It seemed that something special, like a birthday party, was about to happen. Still smiling, I insisted that she had the wrong number and ended the call, saying goodbye. However, before I could relax again, the phone rang for the third time. "Good morning, Grandpa." I explained once more that I wasn't her grandfather. "You are my grandpa, silly," she responded, laughing as if I were joking. When I reaffirmed that there was a mistake, she put down the phone and ran away, shouting in the background, "Daddy, Grandpa is messing with me. He doesn't want to talk to me." Soon, I heard a man's voice answer the phone. "Dad, is everything okay?" With a still amused tone, I explained to him that his daughter was calling the wrong number, and that it was just a big misunderstanding. But he, with concern in his voice, asked, "Dad, are you at home?" "Stay there, we're coming now." Suddenly, he thought I was his father. No longer finding it funny, I tried to explain firmly that he had the wrong number. But what came next was what really scared me. He said my name. "James, I'm worried. We'll be there in 15 minutes. Don't leave." I hung up the phone, confused and a bit unsettled. I stayed in bed, thinking about what could be happening. They didn't call back, and I began to imagine that perhaps it was a prank from some friend. In the following days, I asked several people if they knew anything about it. Everyone denied it. The strangest thing was that both the girl and the man seemed convinced that I was part of their family. And the man not only thought I was his father, but knew my real name. Still intrigued, a few days later, I decided to call back the number. The result, the number didn't exist. It was just an empty sound. To this day, I have no idea what happened. Sometimes I think that perhaps it was a grandchild from some parallel universe trying to talk to me. And by the tone of her voice, the me from that other world seemed to be a very lucky man. I've replayed this incident in my mind countless times over the years. Initially, I chalked it up to a strange coincidence. Perhaps someone misdialed, or there was some technical glitch with the phone network. But the fact that the man knew my name specifically has always disturbed me in a way I can't quite rationalize. About 6 months after it happened, I was visiting my sister in Colorado when I overheard her neighbor mention something about their father named James, who had recently passed away. My ears perked up immediately. I casually joined their conversation and learned that this James had died unexpectedly, while his son and granddaughter were on their way to visit him. They had called him that morning to confirm their visit, and he had sounded confused on the phone. When they arrived at his house 15 minutes later, they found him unconscious from a stroke. He died in the hospital the following day. The coincidence was eerie enough, but what truly sent chills down my spine was when the neighbor mentioned that the granddaughter had a pet guinea pig named Peanut that she talked about constantly, even pretending to call it on her toy phone. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural or parallel universes, but this experience defies any logical explanation I can muster. Was I somehow connected to another James in his final moments? Did some cosmic switchboard operator connect me by mistake to a call meant for someone else's last conversation with their loved ones? I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that Sunday morning, but I do know that whenever my phone rings now and there's no caller ID, I feel a momentary hesitation before answering, wondering if it might be another call from somewhere or someone beyond our understanding. In 2011, I decided to adopt a black Labrador puppy when I began practicing waterfowl hunting. Excited, I immersed myself in several books about training and decided that I would do it myself. Gradually, a routine was established. Every day, before and after work, I dedicated time to train him. From the beginning, I noticed that he wasn't a common dog. He learned commands with impressive ease, and honestly, made the whole process enjoyable. I remember that in the first years, he was just my faithful partner in hunts. Everything changed when one day, I accompanied someone who participated in retriever dog competitions. After some insistence, I decided to enter him in some trials. Surprisingly, he earned the junior hunter and started hunter titles from the AKC and HRC before even completing his second year. However, my excitement with competitions didn't last long. Soon, he returned to being my faithful hunting companion, fulfilling this role masterfully. Over the years, he retrieved hundreds of ducks and shared with me moments that few are lucky enough to experience. Additionally, at home, he was more than a hunting dog. He slept by my side, played with my children, and was undoubtedly the type of animal that appears once in a lifetime. In 2017, One morning, I let him out of the house for his usual needs, but this time he didn't return. Living in a rural area of Montana, I thought he would come back as he always did, but the days passed, and he continued to be missing. I searched for months, posted on social media, talked to neighbors, spread flyers in town, offering a generous reward. It was difficult to accept that he wouldn't return. Today, I have a cane corso. On the night of November 1st, 2022, I was awakened by his barks, which was rare. I got up to see what was happening. When I turned on the porch light, I saw a black Labrador lying there. My gaze was immediately drawn to the collar. Black leather with reflective orange details, and near the buckle, a strip of pink duct tape placed by my children years ago. My heart raced. That collar couldn't be any other than his. To prevent the cane corso from reacting badly, I took him to the laundry room before opening the door. But when I returned, the Labrador had disappeared. I grabbed a flashlight and searched the entire yard, calling for him until dawn. I didn't find him. To this day, I keep trying to understand what happened. I'm reluctant to share this story because it seems unbelievable. 5 years later, do you think it could be him? It's been over 2 years since that night on the porch, and while the memory of seeing him there remains crystal clear, I've begun to question whether it was really him, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. That night has sent me spiraling into deeper questions about what happens to our companions when they leave us. I've spoken with others who have lost beloved pets, and I'm not alone in experiencing what some call visitations. A woman at our local hunting club told me how, 3 months after her German Shepherd died, she distinctly heard his unique 3-bark greeting when she came home one night. Another man described feeling his deceased hunting retriever jump onto his bed in the darkness, circling 3 times before settling against his legs, exactly as she had done every night for 14 years. These stories bring me comfort, but they also lead to more questions. Was it truly his spirit that night? Or was it simply another black lab that happened to be wearing a similar collar? The rational part of my brain insists it must have been a stray that wandered off before I could return. Yet nothing explains the pink tape, that specific, personal detail that only our dog wore. My teenage daughter has a different theory. She believes he found his way back to say goodbye properly, to let us know he was finally at peace. He wouldn't want us wondering forever, Dad, she told me. That's why he came back, so we'd know he was okay. My son, more pragmatic at 15, suggested it might have been one of our neighbors playing a cruel prank, though he couldn't explain why anyone would do such a thing. My wife remains silent on the subject, though I've caught her looking out toward the yard on quiet evenings, as if still expecting to see him trotting up the path. As for me, I take comfort in believing it was him, making one final journey home. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods during hunting season, I swear I can hear the familiar rustling that always indicated he'd found what I'd shot. I turn, half expecting to see him emerging from the brush, head held high with his prize. The woods are always empty, of course, but for just a moment, it feels like he's still with me. I've never been a spiritual man. My faith has always been in what I can see, touch, and prove. But that night has opened something in me that logic can't explain away. Whether it was truly him or just a desperate wish made manifest, I'm grateful for that brief glimpse on the porch, a reminder that some bonds may extend beyond what we understand about life and death. The Cane Corso is a good dog in his own right, loyal, protective, and eager to please. But he hunts differently, lives differently, loves differently. He's not a replacement. No dog ever could be. He's simply the next chapter in our family story. Last week, I finally took down the faded, lost dog flyer that had somehow remained pinned to the community board at our local general store all these years. It felt like the right time to let go, to acknowledge that wherever he is, whether across the Rainbow Bridge or somehow still roaming these Montana hills, he's where he needs to be. And for one brief night in November, so was I. My name is Isabella. I was born and raised in the backwoods of Maine, where even without doctors constantly present, there were experienced midwives and women who knew healing prayers to ease sickness. My family lived in a modest cabin with wooden walls and a tin roof, inherited from my grandparents. There had always been talk about superstitions and people who could cast or break spells. But I never believed much in those stories until everything began to fall apart. When I turned 17, I got pregnant by a boy named Charles from a neighboring township. At first, he swore we would stay together, but as soon as my belly started showing, he disappeared. His mother, Mrs. Jacqueline, made it abundantly clear that she didn't want me to continue with the pregnancy. She would say horrible things to my mother, insinuating that her grandchild would be a burden. Later, I learned there were even inheritance issues involved. Charles was an only child, and Mrs. Jacqueline feared dividing some property with an unwanted grandchild. I tried not to let it affect me, but the situation took a toll on my health. I was constantly sick with nausea and persistent headaches. My mother, Martha, was always my only protector. Even though she was upset about the pregnancy, she remained by my side. When my sickness intensified, we didn't know what to do. There was no hospital nearby, and transportation was difficult to find. We tried common herbal teas, but nothing worked. Then someone suggested we seek out Mrs. Myra, a respected midwife in the region, although some said she did more than just assist with births. I don't trust this witchcraft talk, but let's ask her for some medicine to help you feel better, my mother said. We went to Mrs. Myra's house one late afternoon. It was a wooden structure near a small creek. The place had a strong smell of dried herbs. She examined me in silence, gently touching my belly. Then she prepared a dark green tea and told me to drink it for a few nights. If you feel too much discomfort, come find me again. But avoid walking alone at night, she said while handing me a package of herbs. Her voice sounded calm, but her gaze was unreadable. I returned home somewhat intrigued. My mother didn't comment, but I sensed she was uncomfortable too. I decided to follow the midwife's instructions. On the first night I drank the tea, I slept heavily and had a confusing dream. A thin figure, completely covered by a dark cloth, whispered my name. I woke up startled, and for a few moments I thought someone was in my room. I saw nothing but darkness. I got up, splashed water on my face, and tried to calm down. In the days that followed, the dizziness decreased a bit, but the strange dreams persisted. My mother began to watch over my sleep because I would wake up crying. saying I had seen someone at the door. She hugged me, repeating that I was nervous because of the pregnancy and Charles's abandonment. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The township always had its stories about envy and the evil eye. During that period, I heard many rumors of women who miscarried without explanation or appeared with bruises after their children were born. Sometimes they pointed to Mrs. Myra as a suspect. Other times, someone would talk about powerful prayers commissioned by spiteful people. I didn't want to believe it, but I remembered the way Mrs. Jacqueline looked at me and felt an immediate shiver. She made it clear she didn't want that grandchild. People are saying that your ex-boyfriend's mother is seeking out someone to end your pregnancy. A friend of ours commented one day. My legs trembled when I heard that. My mother preferred not to comment, but at night she began lighting candles around the house, asking God to protect us. When I reached my 4th month of pregnancy, I noticed the baby moved little, and at certain moments abruptly, as if uncomfortable. One afternoon, I felt sharp pains and almost fainted. My mother immediately took me to Mrs. Myra. She examined me and frowned. Everything is fine, but don't let your guard down. Someone might be wishing the worst for you. Saying this, she gave me more tea. I confess that at that moment, my suspicion increased. I didn't know if she was saying this to help me, or if she was also part of something sinister. At the same time, I had no better option. She was the closest midwife, and in case of emergency, I would have to rely on her. As the weeks passed, the nocturnal hallucinations grew. I felt someone watching me while I slept. Every now and then, I seemed to hear a female voice outside. A deep insecurity settled in. My mother then decided to seek help from Mrs. Abigail, a prayer woman who lived quite far away. We traveled by cart on a bumpy road to her house. She was a short woman who received us on a porch full of potted plants. She prayed past sprigs of rue over my body, blew herb smoke around, and then paused pensively. There is a great bitterness against this girl. If you don't take care, it might turn into witchcraft, she said in a serious tone. My mother asked what to do. Mrs. Abigail recommended some prayers, asked me to wear a cord with a small piece of metal that she herself had blessed, and told me not to accept anything from people who might hate me. I left there feeling more at ease, at least for a few days. The dreams diminished, but didn't stop completely. In the 5th month, I began to feel constant anxiety. One night, I woke up with the sensation that someone was touching my belly. It wasn't a physical touch, but almost a strange pressure. I rubbed my eyes and got up, lighting the oil lamp. There was no one in the room, just shadows cast by the furniture. My mother rushed to me, frightened by my scream. I told her what I had felt, and she remained silent for a few moments. We could call the pastor, but he doesn't like these stories and thinks it's all superstition, she said, sounding discouraged. Indeed, the local pastor rejected anything that sounded like witchcraft. He said if I had problems, it would be better to consult a doctor. But a doctor was a luxury for us, and the only nearby health clinic didn't handle births. As the pregnancy progressed, rumors in the township increased. They spoke of other women who had been harmed by someone who sent evil prayers. They never mentioned me by name, but I noticed the looks of pity or fear when I passed by. Someone let slip that it was Mrs. Jacqueline who was paying for me to lose the baby. My mother made a point of not telling me everything, but I could see she was increasingly agonized. At the turn from the 6th to the 7th month of pregnancy, I had an unexpected loss of blood. I thought I was going to miscarry. I was in despair. My mother called Mrs. Myra in a hurry. She arrived with a bag of clean cloths and a dark liquid to stop the bleeding. I spent the entire night awake in pain, not knowing if the baby would survive. But by morning, I noticed the bleeding had reduced and the pains had eased. I needed to rest, which left me confined to bed, increasingly fragile and vulnerable to the restlessness of my mind. One night, lying in my room, I clearly heard a footstep in the hallway. I called my mother softly, but she was in the kitchen. When I managed to get up, I didn't see anyone. The next day, I told her what had happened, and she decided to call Mrs. Abigail again for a prayer. The prayer woman came, burned incense, prayed Bible passages, and made protective gestures around the house. In the end, she hugged me and said, "You have to strengthen yourself. Be aware that there are those who want you to despair, so you'll lose the child." She spoke with such conviction that I shivered. I began to cling even more to prayers, even though I didn't have much faith before. The truth is, in that situation, any support was valid. During the 7th month, my mother watched me all the time. I avoided going out alone and only walked around the yard to get some air. One night, a neighbor knocked on the door saying she had seen 3 women in black near our house, talking suspiciously. She said that when she tried to approach, they quickly moved away and disappeared. My mother turned pale, praying softly. I tried not to imagine the worst, but the stories of witchcraft there were very old, and someone was always telling a similar account. The pregnancy continued to progress, but without mental respite. I barely slept, terrified at the thought that someone might attack me or perform some kind of spell against me and my baby. When I entered the 8th month, I noticed my body was increasingly debilitated. I felt strong pains in my lower back, as if something was weighing much more than normal. Mrs. Myra insisted my baby was healthy, but in a strange position which could complicate the birth. And indeed, the birth came early. It was on a suffocating dawn. I woke up with intense cramps and the feeling that something was wrong. The water broke before the right time, and I estimated I was around 32 or 33 weeks pregnant. My mother ran to Mrs. Myra's house, who came with her tools and settled me on a mat. A labor of almost an entire day began because the baby wasn't positioned correctly. I sweated so much that I thought I would pass out at any moment. On top of everything, the house seemed gripped by a silent tension, as if something or someone was watching us. My mother went in and out several times to fetch water, while the midwife tried to adjust the baby. "I need you to breathe deeply and push with all your strength," Mrs. Myra said. I obeyed, but I felt my body was locked. At certain moments, it seemed as if someone was pressing my belly from the outside, as if trying to prevent the birth. The midwife noticed my desperation and asked my mother to bring boiled water. After countless contractions, I felt such a strong stab that I almost screamed breathlessly. It was the final push. I felt the baby slide, but I didn't hear an immediate cry. Everything turned into a blur. My sight darkened for seconds. When I came to, I was lying down, panting, and I saw Mrs. Myra rubbing my son's tiny body. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. My mother prayed on her knees. Suddenly, a weak moan turned into a cry, and I realized he was alive. A wave of relief washed over my body. However, it didn't last long. I felt a gust of air entering through the door, as if someone had opened it. I wanted to turn my head, but I was too tired. My mother let out a scream. "Close that door. There's someone there." I heard a murmur, or perhaps I imagined it. Mrs. Myra ran to the entrance and saw only the wind swaying the trees. She returned, frightened, and asked my mother to lock everything. I didn't have the strength to ask anything. I held my baby, who was breathing weakly and was born small and fragile, which caused immediate concern. Still, it was impossible to hold back the tears. I spent the following hours not letting go of him, afraid that some evil presence might appear. In the days that followed, with the baby in my arms, I thought the worst had passed, but mysterious marks began to appear. Every now and then, he would wake up with scratches on his belly or legs, superficial but alarming. My mother, desperate, called Mrs. Abigail. The prayer woman returned, prayed, blessed, hung sprigs of rosemary on the door, and gave the baby an herbal bath. For a few days it worked, then the marks reappeared. "Let's leave this place," my mother said. "I don't want to live in this tension anymore." I felt fear at the thought of leaving everything behind, but I agreed. It was better to try a fresh start somewhere else. We took our few clothes and left without fanfare in the early morning for a farm where a distant uncle lived. He was a man of few friends, but he didn't deny us shelter. My mother had a small amount saved, the result of some of my grandfather's old work, plus some savings she had from sewing and washing clothes. This would help us with our travels. The problem was that in the first nights, the baby cried more than usual, and some purple marks returned to his little body. My uncle thought it was just a child who moved during his sleep, but my mother and I knew it wasn't that simple. On certain dawns, we heard noises on the roof, like light footsteps. My uncle would go out with a flashlight, but found nothing. Gradually, he became irritated, thinking we would bring trouble to his house. After a few weeks, he practically asked us to leave. We took to the road again, without a clear destination. My mother continued to use the money that remained from the little she received for occasional services. Upon arriving at the villages, I also helped with any task that paid a few coins. So we continued, stopping from place to place, looking for a safe place. In these wanderings, we found a healer named Jane, who charged us a sum in exchange for a protection ritual. She sprinkled white powder on the windows of where we were staying and said a long prayer. But the next morning, the baby appeared with 2 lines on his right arm, like fingernail scratches. My mother cried, and I felt a growing anger at not being able to protect him. We moved again, this time to a small boarding house in a simple area of another county. The room was cramped, smelled musty, and had an abandoned look. On the first night, nothing abnormal happened, which gave me hope that we had escaped the supposed spell. But the peace didn't last long. On the 3rd day, I woke up in the middle of the night, with the baby crying as if he was scared. Upon lighting the candle, I noticed there was a small cut on his forehead. My mother took him in her arms, trying to calm him, and whispered, "We won't find peace as long as those people continue to hate us." When dawn broke, I went out in search of a church to ask for help. The local priest treated me as if I were exaggerating, saying I needed medical supervision, and that stories of witchcraft were the result of superstition. I was indignant but controlled myself. Returning to the boarding house, I found my mother talking with the owner, who also advised us to find another place if we didn't feel safe there. With each place we tried, it seemed that something followed us, or that people didn't want to deal with our afflictions. My mother began to say she regretted not directly confronting Mrs. Jacqueline. She believed that perhaps a confrontation would be the only way to end it. I was terrified. Just hearing Charles's mother's name reminded me of the looks of contempt. I preferred to continue fleeing rather than have an encounter that could end badly. In one of these journeys, we heard about a well-known healer called Raphael, who lived in a more northern region. He worked with liberation rituals, according to the comments. We decided to seek him out. It took us 2 days to reach his house, a simple shed surrounded by bamboo. He received us calmly and listened to everything we had experienced without expressing surprise. He asked to hold the baby, and after some time observing, he commented, "There is something very heavy against you, but I can try to avert the worst." We scheduled a night for the ritual. He asked for soil from the path we had traveled, some specific colored candles, and a bottle of holy water. We spent an entire night in prayers with him, drawing symbols on the ground and asking me to hold my son in the center of a circle of coarse salt. At a certain point, Raphael took a small dark cloth object, saying that it represented the evil intention sent by those who hated us. After many prayers and chants, he burned that cloth, which quickly turned to ashes. I felt a strong wind entering through the door, as if trying to extinguish the candles, but they resisted. At one point, I heard a tinkling of objects, but I didn't see anyone touching them. The healer, however, continued the prayers without being shaken. At dawn, he said that if there was still resentment from those who hated us, the problem wouldn't be completely over, but he hoped that would give us some relief. After leaving the shed, we went to a boarding house in the same region where we spent a few days without noticing new marks on the baby. This gave us the strength to continue. My mother and I managed by washing clothes and cooking for people, collecting small coins to survive. Sometimes I would find someone who indicated a public hospital in another city, but without enough money, it was difficult to travel there. One day, a woman said she had seen someone asking about a girl who was fleeing with her child. My mother and I almost panicked, fearing it might be an emissary of Mrs. Jacqueline or even her herself. Weeks later, nothing concrete happened. Still, we continued to change boarding houses in an exhausting routine of packing and unpacking old suitcases. The baby was already a few months old, and I suffered to see him grow without a real home, without a fixed place. It was then that the opportunity arose to work on a distant farm, where a man needed people to take care of the kitchen. The foreman was called Joel, and my mother got in contact through an acquaintance. The place was quite isolated, but he promised us at least a roof. We departed by bus, using what remained of our small change and carrying our bundles. The journey was long, full of stops. Upon arrival, the foreman received us with curiosity, but without many questions. The farm was large, with plantations and a corral. He took us to a small room next to the tool shed and said we could stay there in exchange for work. In that place, during the first weeks, I slept without frights. The baby would cry, but I didn't find recent scratches or bruises. My mother woke up early to wash the foreman's family's clothes while I helped the cook. At least we were eating better. Little by little, we got to know the farm workers, all simple people. There was a man named Robert who looked at me with kindness. I wasn't in the mood for relationships, but he always offered help, asking if the baby needed anything. Time passed, and I began to hope that torment had been left behind. I confess that now and then, I would wake up in the middle of the night with the impression of hearing something outside. But when I looked through the crack, there was nothing beyond the dark terrain. I preferred to think it was just some animal. Once the foreman casually commented, "They say that from time to time, strange people appear in the surroundings, but I've never seen anything. It's just a legend from those who are afraid of the dark." I didn't want to feed the subject. I kept focused on working so he wouldn't expel us. After some time, the baby was almost a year old. He recovered well despite the premature birth and had no apparent sequelae. He learned to stand, emitting little screams. My mother and I felt a happiness we hadn't experienced in a long time. It seemed that finally, life was following a normal course. It was then that I fell ill, a fever that left my head throbbing. I spent 2 days in bed, and my mother had to take care of her grandson while still doing her chores. My baby missed my lap, but I couldn't even stand up straight. I recovered gradually. During this interval, Robert brought us some vegetables from the garden to strengthen the broth my mother was making. He was kind, and we ended up getting close. One day he asked me why I didn't have a ring or mention the father of my child. I preferred not to tell the whole truth. I just said the father had abandoned us. Robert didn't insist. The time on the farm flowed. I had the impression that the prayers and rituals of the healer had indeed protected us, or that by moving so much, we had lost the trail of whoever was pursuing us. There were no more direct attacks, scratches, or that nocturnal anguish. The foreman freed a small piece of land for me to plant vegetables. My mother adapted well to the kitchen work, and my son, whom we now called John, grew with curiosity for the plantations. I spent about 2 years there. During this period, John began to speak his first words. He learned to run through the beaten earth patios. The simple life was good for me. It was impossible not to remember the times of terror, but I tried to keep that stored as something distant. One night, however, I heard a noise at the door. I took an oil lamp, opened it slowly, and only saw the wind swaying a piece of wood. I went back inside with my heart racing. There was no one there, but I remained alert for several days. My mother, despite everything, also felt that we were on the right path. She said if someone still hates us, they don't know where we are. Let's stay like this, in silence and without giving news. I agreed. I swallowed the longing for the land where I was born and moved forward. With time, Robert became more than a friend. He helped me with John, played with him, built wooden toys. I was reluctant to fully trust, but gradually I gave in. He didn't know the past in detail, and I didn't want to speak to not scare him away. When John was almost 3 years old, something happened that gave me a small scare. One afternoon, the farm cook approached me with a serious expression. "I need to warn you of something. I dreamed that a woman was asking me where you and your son were. She was in black and spoke to me in a strange tone." My spine went rigid. Despite having avoided cliches and superstitions, it was impossible not to connect this to the past. She came to watch around the house and asked the employees if anyone strange had appeared, but no one confirmed. I was tense for a few weeks, waiting for any sign that someone from outside would appear asking about me. Nothing happened. The farm followed its routine. The foreman didn't even know about this dream. I preferred not to spread the story to not complicate myself. A year later, I realized that Robert and I were becoming an improvised family. He was a decent worker. He slept in the men's lodging, but spent his nights off with me and my mother. He took care of John with affection. Thinking about this, I decided it was time to baptize my son in the small chapel that was in a village a few hours by cart from there. Without fanfare, we organized everything. I got simple clothes for John, and the foreman granted 2 days off. It was a modest ceremony with the local priest, who had no prejudice against our past or against my situation as a single mother. After the baptism, I returned to the farm with a feeling of relief. My mother also said she felt more protected. A few weeks passed, and I realized that no more rumors surfaced of people looking for us. My son ran healthily through the courtyards, playing with other children. One day, I thought about the possibility of someone from my old region discovering where I was, but I concluded that years had passed. Perhaps Mrs. Jacqueline had given up or found other concerns. Perhaps her hatred had been replaced by other problems. My mother agreed that we would stay there until old age, without returning to our place of origin. With time, the farm became our definitive home. I was able to build, with the help of Robert and the foreman, a larger room. I raised chickens and planted cassava. John was already 5 years old when we had a small birthday party for him. My mother, though older, helped in the kitchen, and we invited some neighbors from the surroundings. Seeing my son blow out, the improvised candle brought tears to my eyes. I remembered everything I went through so that he could live. I was internally grateful that we had found peace. I never heard news of Charles, John's father, nor of Mrs. Jacqueline. I also didn't seek to know what happened to Mrs. Myra, the midwife who attended me, nor with Mrs. Abigail, the prayer woman who tried to protect me. The healer Raphael continued his life, I imagine. I prefer to keep a distance from all that past. I still keep, in a way, the metal cord that Mrs. Abigail gave me, even without using it anymore. It's a reminder that in difficult moments, I clung to any symbol of faith. Today, I tell this story because I feel I need to share what I lived through. It's not a memory I like to revisit, but I believe many women go through something similar, surrounded by fears and threats that seem inexplicable. If it was witchcraft or just the cruelty of a resentful family, I don't know for sure. But I know that I fled and protected my son in the best way I could. I never had the courage to directly confront those who hated us. I chose to escape, change places, resist until I managed to have my boy be born and grow up. No one else asked me about the marks that appeared on John's body. They disappeared little by little. Nothing prevented him from becoming a strong and happy boy. My mother aged peacefully on the farm, and I allowed myself to build a new relationship, something I never imagined after so much pain. Even though deep down I still fear that one day someone will knock on my door, I ask myself if it's worth living in fear. Usually I answer no. Of all the lessons I learned, the main one is that some people's resentment can transform into something destructive. I don't know if there is or isn't something beyond what we call the visible world, but I know that at that time, everything indicated that negative forces were around us and almost took my son away. Today, I prefer to focus on the simple life I managed to build. The pain and fear became chapters of a story that, thanks to God or destiny, had an outcome of tranquility. Now I live with the certainty that my boy, who is already grown, doesn't even remember the early times. And that consoles me. If one day he wants to know details, I will tell him carefully, showing that a mother's faith and love can overcome even the shadows that insist on surrounding us. It's a painful memory, but also a victory. He is alive, I am here. And we move forward without looking back. My name is Nicholas. I was born in a rural area of Virginia, in a modest house that always needed repairs. My family consisted of my father Silas, my mother Rebecca, and my younger sister Iris. For many years, we lived with little, trying to save every penny to pay overdue bills. My father hated this condition. He wasn't the type to explode easily, but you could tell when he was consumed by thoughts about what we would call financial failure. It was as if he was trapped in a maze, and every day the corridors got tighter. For as long as I can remember, I watched Silas come and go from jobs that paid almost nothing, collecting bill receipts and typing numbers into an old calculator. He made a point of keeping me away from these worries, but I could tell something was eating at him. Some nights I would hear him talking with Rebecca in the kitchen. She tried to soften the situation, saying that having a roof and a united family was enough, but he didn't agree. He talked about the ambitions he had before getting married. He swore he didn't want to spend his entire life being bitter about debts. Around my 13th birthday, Silas began to disappear frequently. Sometimes he would be gone all day, saying he was at interviews or resolving documentation issues. Rebecca didn't question out loud, although I noticed her nervousness. Once he came home late, without giving me any explanations. I felt like asking where he had been, but I stayed quiet. The next morning, I was surprised to see him excited, saying he had found a golden opportunity. He didn't mention details, but he seemed genuinely satisfied, something rare for him. A few weeks passed, and the change in our lives was striking. Silas appeared with enough money to pay off most of the overdue bills and renovate parts of the house. Instead of the eternal leaks in the roof, he replaced everything with new shingles, bought different clothes, and even had our old motorcycle repaired, which had been sitting idle for a long time. The sudden turnaround made Rebecca suspicious, but she didn't argue. You could see she held back her curiosity, perhaps out of fear of discovering what was behind it all. A few months later, Silas announced he had secured a larger house elsewhere, surrounded by land. He spoke as if it were an extraordinary achievement. I didn't get to object, but Rebecca's tense expression bothered me. I was 14, and I saw Iris at 7 years old, so innocent and quiet at the prospect of changing schools and routines. Still, she didn't express any excitement. When the new truck that Silas had bought arrived, Iris just glanced at it and went back to playing in the yard without reaction. She seemed to understand that our life was heading toward something unknown. The move took place on a weekend. The new house was quite spacious. It had a metal gate, a corridor with some trees, and further on, the main door. Everything was so big that I felt somewhat lost. The decoration included antique furniture, left by previous owners. I couldn't tell if I found it beautiful or strange. Iris complained of a weird smell in one of the rooms, but Silas said to ignore it, assuring that everything would soon be impeccable. During the first nights, I noticed a different silence. It was the kind of isolated place that didn't let you hear cars or neighbors. Only some nocturnal birds sang now and then. This caused me some anxiety. A few days later, I noticed that Silas was spending long hours in the improvised office he had set up in one of the rooms. He would come out pensive, his eyes sunken as if he had spent the night awake. Rebecca started becoming nervous. I saw her lighting candles in the living room and asking Iris not to wander too far down the hallways. Sometimes she would come into my room just to ask if I was okay. I found it strange because there had never been this kind of overprotection before. She didn't explain the reason for so much caution, but I felt something was disturbing her. When I asked what was wrong, she hesitated. "Trust me, Nicholas. Sometimes it's better not to know everything." Shortly afterward, some strangers began to visit Silas. They would arrive at night, always dressed in dark clothes, enter through the front door, talk to him in low voices, and leave without saying goodbye. It wasn't long before even Rebecca avoided moving around the house when they appeared. She seemed to fear running into some unwanted guest. Once she whispered, "These meetings of your father's don't seem normal to me." I asked if she had discovered how Silas had gotten so much money, but she just shook her head. "Take care of Iris and don't insist on questioning your father." I didn't understand why, but I agreed. As the weeks passed, Silas became more introspective. He didn't make jokes, didn't take us anywhere, spent hours locked in his office, or left without saying where he was going. I tried not to think about it, but that atmosphere bothered me, and Iris then began to wake up startled. She talked about feeling someone walking through the corridor near her room. When I tried to calm her down, she said something vague, as if she saw a shadow standing in a corner. I asked if she was sure. She just looked at me with a frightened expression. One afternoon, we received the news that one of our aunts, Rebecca's sister, had suffered a fatal accident on the road. The car rolled over for no clear reason, and the authorities couldn't explain what had happened. Rebecca was devastated. I thought Silas, even being somewhat distant, would console his wife, but he reacted coldly, merely saying he was sorry and went to the office. This indifference gave me chills. I began to wonder if my father was still the man I had known in childhood. After my aunt's funeral, the house became more somber. Rebecca started locking the doors even before nightfall and recommended, "Nicholas, stay close to me and your sister. Don't think about walking around the house alone." I understood she feared something, but I couldn't say what. Every night, I heard sounds of light footsteps. I would go down to the living room to see if it was Silas walking around, but he always said he didn't leave the office. Iris continued sleeping poorly. At times, she would sit up in bed and point to corners of the room without saying anything. One night, my father received more visitors. I went to get water in the kitchen, and while passing through the living room, I saw Silas with his back turned, head down, surrounded by 3 men speaking quietly. I caught a word or two like contract and guarantee, but I didn't understand the context. Back in my room, I tried to sleep, but I kept imagining if that group had a connection to how Silas had become rich. The next day, the tension reached a point that seemed unbearable. Rebecca called me in the corridor and instructed me. If your father asks you anything about me or your sister, just say you don't know anything. Don't trust these men who come here. I tried to ask why. She just insisted that I obey her. Later, while I was reading a book in the living room, Silas approached, stared at me with a tired look, but didn't say anything. He sat down nearby and remained motionless. That silence bothered me, so I got up and went to my room. Iris began to get sick. She had fever almost every night. I was frightened one late afternoon when she appeared in the living room, pale, unable to stop shaking. Rebecca took her to the doctor, but nothing conclusive emerged from the exams. The professionals collected blood and checked vital signs, but found no explanation for the fever. A week later, in the middle of the night, the fever returned even worse. The only thing Iris said, almost crying, was that she wanted to go back to our house before. Seeing Iris's suffering and Silas's coldness, Rebecca decided we should leave that house. She planned everything in secret, packed bags, and asked me not to mention anything to my father. The same night that Silas left with one of the strange men, we called a taxi and departed in a hurry. Iris was so weak she could barely speak. In the car, Rebecca just looked out the window, as if fearing someone might follow us. We stayed at a motel near a highway. The environment was simple, but seemed safe. The owner didn't ask many questions, just handed over the key and pointed the way to the room. We spent the first hours locked in there. The only sound was trucks passing in the distance. 2 days passed without news from Silas. My mother made some calls to acquaintances, but no one knew of his whereabouts. During this interval, Iris was getting worse. She had nightmares, woke up frightened, murmuring that someone was calling for her. I tried to calm her, but I was as confused as she was. It was during this period that I began to understand where the resources for our travels came from. My mother had received part of the money left from selling the old house, added to the savings she secretly kept. Some distant relatives also helped, though without having a complete notion of what was happening. Even so, the reserves were limited. It was then that on the 3rd day, the motel owner warned that a man had passed by asking about us. He didn't give a name and left quickly. Rebecca decided we couldn't stay put. We packed our bags at night and took another taxi to the bus station. From there, we traveled to a larger city, hoping to disappear in the crowd. Upon arrival, we rented a small room in an old building, full of narrow corridors. The place smelled of mold, but it was what our money allowed. Rebecca locked the door as soon as we entered and didn't leave Iris's side. At the end of that week, we learned of Silas's whereabouts. An acquaintance called my mother saying they had found my father lifeless in an abandoned warehouse far from busy areas. There were no signs of aggression or any explicit violence. We were devastated. Rebecca packed things, and we immediately departed to identify the body. Upon arriving at the scene, police officers didn't let us get too close. From a distance, I saw Silas leaning against a wall with his body arched. An officer commented that his eyes were in such a strange state that no one could explain how he died. My mother signed the necessary papers without saying anything. The funeral was small. Few colleagues appeared. I noticed the presence of a person who vaguely reminded me of the men who appeared at our house. He stayed in the back without speaking to us. After the coffin descended into the grave, the fellow disappeared. We returned to that old room in the bigger city. Rebecca changed her behavior, keeping the curtains closed, not answering phone calls, and mentally going over the last days. Iris remained quiet. She seemed to feel not only her father's death, but something more, as if something was lurking. I began to examine a notebook that Silas had left at home, full of strange notes. It talked about businesses I never heard mentioned, and also had scribbles that looked like dates followed by vague descriptions like renew or fulfill. There were even names of distant relatives we didn't know. The nights in that city were no different. Car noise, people on the street, but we didn't get tense. The feeling of being watched persisted in every corridor of the building. Although I didn't want to call it supernatural, something in the atmosphere aroused my fear. Rebecca, in turn, sought out an acquaintance who, I heard, understood mystical matters, but she returned without anything concrete. She just repeated that there's no easy way out for this kind of thing. One day, Iris had an intense crying fit, clutching my hand, saying she had dreamed of Silas standing in front of the door. My mother heard this but didn't react. She seemed too exhausted to seek explanations. That night, strange sounds echoed through the building. The owner said she heard knocks on the wall and footsteps in that wing where we stayed. We pretended not to know anything, although Rebecca was already planning to move us again. We took few suitcases and left with the intention of returning to the interior or to some less visible place. The trip was long. We passed through unknown villages. My mother insisted we needed to talk to someone more experienced in breaking curses. She used that word in a joking tone, but it sounded with some truth to it. I until then wasn't sure if I believed in something like that, but I was beginning to consider any possibility. Finally, we arrived at a rural area where we were directed to a lady known by locals for performing blessing rituals. Her house had a dirt floor, simple walls, and unstable electricity. She received us with suspicion, talked privately with my mother, and asked me to wait on the porch. Iris lay down beside me, holding my hand. We noticed that night fell in complete darkness, with no light posts nearby. Inside the house, only an oil lamp illuminated the environment. The next day, the lady called my mother and said something in a low voice, but it was obvious there wasn't a quick solution. She said that some debts extend beyond life, and it's not enough to pray to break this kind of bond. After that, we said goodbye to her and continued our journey. Being back on the road always gave the same feeling of escape. We traveled from bus to bus, seeking some corner, and Iris remained in deep silence, sometimes crying, feeling pains in her stomach. In one of these stops, my body began to show signs of exhaustion. I had dizziness and even fell to my knees in a bus terminal without the strength to get up. Rebecca and Iris helped me sit on a bench. After a few minutes, I recovered my breath, but a stinging persisted at the back of my neck. Eventually, we returned to a more populated municipality. We rented a room in a very humble boarding house with a smell of old food in the corridors. We spent a few days there, and I began to notice that Iris's health wasn't improving and that my mother barely slept. To make matters worse, once again someone appeared at the reception asking about us without identifying themselves. Rebecca trembled with nervousness, but tried to disguise it. That night, I was startled when I tried to use the public phone in the corridor and heard a faint noise on the other end, as if someone was breathing. I hung up immediately. I asked the boarding house owner if there was any problem with the line, but she assured me there wasn't. I returned to the room and found Iris sweating on the bed, repeating that she had seen a man in dark clothes in the courtyard. I went to the window, looked, and there was nothing. I preferred not to insist on the subject, so as not to scare her more. With increasing attention, I decided to examine Silas's notebook again. I noticed several mentions of past and future meetings. There was a part that listed family names with annotations like, "The next must assume, and the blood continues." It seemed nonsense, but I remembered how our father lived in anguish before getting all that money. Perhaps he had gotten involved in something that required a greater sacrifice. And now the bill was left for us. I observed that Silas wrote about an association to which he had to report periodically, mentioning that the agreement would extend to descendants if he failed. A few days later, we decided to leave again. We needed to avoid being found. We took a bus to another place that was indicated to us, where a resident understood ancient promises. After hours of travel, we arrived at a simple ranch. The fragile-looking woman received us with little willingness to talk, but allowed us to stay one night there. At dawn, she explained that if the agreement had been established by my father's lineage, it wouldn't be broken just by escape. She waved her hands in a sign of impotence and told us to be careful. There were weeks without a defined direction. Iris had recurring fevers, and my mother had to urgently admit her to a public hospital where she received medication and stayed 2 days under observation. New exams were done, but no results explained the causes. During the nights at the hospital, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the corridors illuminated by white lamps, and each step sounded strange to me. At one point, I noticed a man in a dark suit at the reception, but when I got there, I didn't find anyone. It might have been my imagination, but I felt a tightness in my chest. I preferred not to tell Rebecca or Iris about this. Iris's fever subsided, and we were able to leave the hospital. We got another modest boarding house. We were greeted by an old man who didn't ask questions about our situation. The room had poorly painted walls and smelled of old closets. On the first night there, around 2 a.m, I heard subtle knocks on the door. I thought about opening it to check, but I gave up. I waited a few seconds. The noise ceased. My mother noticed I was awake and whispered, "Nicholas, don't open. Whoever it is, don't open." I closed my eyes but didn't sleep. The silence was so dense that I could hear my own breathing. In the morning, I asked the boarding house man if anyone had knocked on our door. He denied it, saying all the other guests were sleeping. I decided not to insist. Meanwhile, we consulted anyone who might have had contact with Silas in life. Most said he suddenly appeared with money and avoided details. The only repeated information was that he had participated in a mysterious association. Each different account pointed to something illegal or something more esoteric. Nothing was certain, but it was evident that the money brought disastrous consequences. My mother decided to return to the big house where it all began, claiming that perhaps we would find answers among the belongings we left behind. We arrived there close to sundown. The construction was closed, with sealed windows. An improvised guard checked our documents and let us in. We walked through the corridors covered in dust. We felt a heavy atmosphere despite being used to tension. I rummaged through some cabinets until I found a sealed box. Inside were papers similar to Silas's notebook, disconnected notes, symbols, and the date when the house purchase was formalized. The strange thing was a small envelope with a text that talked about maintaining the legacy. My mother, upon seeing that, whispered, "Nicholas, these things didn't come from nowhere. Your father knew what he was getting into." Iris began to complain of a headache. We left without getting much clarification, but with the certainty that Silas had plunged into something that affected everyone in the family. On the way out, I noticed the guard watching us, but I kept calm. We returned to the boarding house, packed our bags again. The owner of the place was already showing discomfort with our presence, because the room we occupied seemed to attract disturbing events, creaks, knocks, and according to some guests, even sighs that came in the early morning. The following night, I went to the bathroom at the end of the corridor. When I returned, Iris was waiting for me at the door, distressed. I heard voices from inside. I quickly entered to see if there was anyone, but I found nothing. Rebecca was sitting on the bed, praying in silence. I went back to close the door and thought, we can't continue this nomadic life forever. 2 days later, I suffered a sudden fainting in the boarding house hall. My mother managed to help me. I felt an intense weakness in my legs and breathing. I woke up on a couch. Not knowing how much time had passed, the proprietor brought water and recommended I go to a health clinic. However, I didn't feel ready to explain to a doctor what was happening to us. The next morning, the boarding house proprietor politely asked us to look for another place. She said our stay was agitating the environment. Rebecca agreed, realizing that our life there would not sustain for much longer. We took a bus to another municipality. This time we didn't know who to turn to, but we went anyway. As we traveled down the road, I noticed that I was already almost 16 years old. It had been almost 2 years since we left the first house, and everything that happened in this period left me increasingly tired. On the bus, I saw Iris sleeping, leaning on our mother's shoulder, exhausted, and Rebecca maintained a lost gaze out the window. It was as if she was without hope. We arrived at our destination after several hours, almost at night. We stayed in a small room of a shared house. The owner showed us how to get there through a side staircase. We climbed up with our bags and didn't see anyone else. I settled on a bed leaning against the wall, and Iris and Rebecca stayed on the other. The environment was stuffy and had only one lamp that flickered twice before fully lighting up. I was already exhausted from so many changes when, in the middle of the night, I heard my mother whispering, "If the problem isn't resolved, we're going to lose more than a night's sleep." I turned to try to hear better, but she spoke so low that I didn't catch everything. I thought it better not to ask. Iris was sleeping deeply, perhaps for the first time in weeks, without waking up in the middle of the night. The next day, it came up in conversation with the owner that someone had gone there early in the morning asking if there was a family with a woman, a young man, and a small girl staying there. She replied that she didn't know anyone with that profile. Rebecca and I looked at each other, certain that we were still being sought. We just didn't know if it was those men linked to my father's money, or something beyond rational explanation. In the afternoon of that same week, I went back to leaf through Silas's notebook. I found a page where, in shaky handwriting, it read, "Blood ties sustain the agreement." Underneath was another more scribbled and illegible phrase. I took a pen and tried to see if I could distinguish the original writing against the light, but I only saw smudges. With a heavy heart, I remembered Silas teaching me to ride a bike when I was younger. How could everything change so much in so little time? My eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let my mother hear. She already had enough worries. The pains in the back of my neck returned in the middle of the night. I sat up, trying to breathe deeply. Rebecca woke up and noticed my state. She asked if I needed a doctor. Before I could answer, we heard a dry noise on the floor below, as if something heavy had fallen. We stayed quiet, and Iris didn't wake up. I waited for some time, but nothing else happened. The lamp flickered again. My mother sighed and went back to lie down. The next day, the owner said some old box had tumbled in her storage room, and she made a vague comment about feeling a strange air in the rooms. It was then that we decided once more to look for another place. We didn't have the means to pay for accommodation for long, but there was still part of the money we received when selling old belongings. My mother also did small sewing jobs while I tried to help with heavy tasks, collecting small change for the basics. We gathered what little remained and left. Before departing, my mother received a call on the corridor phone. It was a number she didn't know. She answered and remained silent for a few seconds. Then she hung up. From her face, I could tell it was something serious. I didn't ask anything, didn't explain anything. She just gathered Iris and called me to leave. The next journey was long. We took 2 buses and arrived at a region where a family who was friends with my grandparents owned a vacant small house. We asked to stay there for a while. They accepted without asking many questions. The house was cramped, made of wood, with 2 windows that faced an empty lot. Inside, there was a strong smell of humidity. Even so, we were grateful for the opportunity to stay there. I slept on a thin mattress in the living room, and my mother and Iris shared the bedroom. The first 2 nights passed relatively calmly until, on the third, I woke up with a tightness in my chest and cold sweat. I heard Rebecca whispering my name. I got up and went to the bedroom. Iris was lying down, but with a strange expression. It wasn't exactly pain, but something that left her paralyzed. I tried to talk to her, and she blinked her eyes very slowly. Rebecca said the girl had a high fever in the middle of the night, and almost took her to the hospital again. The 3 of us stayed awake until dawn. After a few more days, the family that provided the house began to show concern. They commented that noises emerged in our area during the night. Rebecca promised that we would leave there soon too. I just wanted to stop feeling like a burden to people. But there was no denying that something was out of the ordinary. I decided to confront my mother. "Mom, there has to be an explanation for all this. What's really happening?" She took a deep breath and told me that before marrying, Silas had already heard stories in his family about a kind of tradition that involved seeking money at any cost. But no one took it seriously, thinking they were legends. Over time, my father, desperate for not being able to support the house, gave in to what he called an alternative. From what Rebecca understood, this agreement wasn't just with people of flesh and bone, but with something that surpassed the normal plane. She didn't get to see any specific ritual, but she believed Silas had made a commitment to obtain money in exchange for something deeper that involved future generations. It was as if there was a requirement that the family continue, tied to that association, even after the death of whoever signed. We fell silent after that. We didn't know what kind of force could manifest, or in what way this would happen. But the evidence was that Silas's death hadn't ended the debt. When she finished speaking, I heard a crack in the wooden structure of the house. It seemed just the wind, but after everything we had lived through, it's hard not to relate it to anything else. Iris wasn't getting better, so we decided to move again. It was almost impossible to keep track of how many different places we had passed through. We got on a night bus. The journey lasted several hours, crossing dirt roads and stopping at small bus terminals. At one of these points, I got off to buy water. Upon returning, I thought I saw a man in a suit standing in the distance. When I blinked, he wasn't there anymore. It could have been just someone passing by, but my heart raced. Arriving at the next destination, we managed to rent a room at the back of a house, where an elderly woman took care of 2 grandchildren. She let us stay there as long as we paid in advance. Rebecca accepted without hesitation. We entered the room that was as simple as the others we had already occupied. It had a window with a grimy curtain and a single lamp on the ceiling. In the first days, I tried to help Iris study a bit, as she had been out of school for many months. Her fever seemed less constant, but still arose around midnight. Once I stayed awake until sunrise, looking at the window, feeling as if something was hovering outside. I avoided creating far-fetched explanations, but the doubt left me disturbed. After 2 weeks, the homeowner commented she had spotted a man prowling the neighborhood, asking questions about us. My stomach turned when I heard this. Rebecca just shook her head, as if she already expected something like that. Iris, in one of her night crises, murmured, "He was out there." I asked who she was talking about, but she didn't respond. She seemed in a trance. Shortly after, she fell asleep. It was then that the symptoms I had been feeling intensified. I began to have severe headaches. Rebecca thought about taking me to the health clinic, but I didn't want to deal with documents anymore. I was afraid of being found, because we were always under some watchful eye. In a way, I saw that each day my body seemed to weaken, as if I was slowly being drained of energy. It didn't cross my mind that it was something supernatural, but the circumstances left me confused. On a night of light rain, I received a final blow. I fainted at the door of the room. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on an improvised chair, and Iris, in tears, held my hand asking me to be okay. Rebecca just looked at me with nowhere to run. I don't know how long I remained confused, but when I got up, I had the strange sensation that my life was following the same path as my father's, heading for an unexplained ending. I closed my eyes, trying to push away that thought. The following dawn, something happened that marked me. The house fell into a deep silence. Not even the rain hit the roof anymore. At a certain moment, I noticed the door was unlocked, although I was sure I had closed it before going to sleep. I went there, turned the key, and heard on the outside footsteps moving away. I opened to see, but the corridor was empty. I called my mother without making noise and told her what had happened. She held my arm and said not to mess with it anymore, to go back and lock it again. I obeyed, but the restlessness didn't pass. At dawn, I spoke with the homeowner, who denied having walked around there. Rebecca decided we would depart once more, but I confess that at that moment, I already felt without strength to face more changes. We packed the bags slowly. I asked her to take care of Iris. Meanwhile, I went to the small backyard to breathe a bit. I saw that the little fence was open, and there were marks of light footsteps in the wet soil, as if someone had really passed by there in the early morning. It wasn't long before we called a car and left. We headed to another, even more remote region. In the car, Rebecca and Iris dozed. I looked at the landscape through the window and recalled Sila's. I felt a mixture of longing and anger. He left a legacy we didn't want, and even after death, he seemed to pull the family to a place where there is no peace. We left the car at an isolated point because the driver didn't want to go beyond a certain road. We continued on foot, with Iris complaining of tiredness. We arrived at a simple wooden house where a friend of Rebecca's lived. She gave us 2 thin mattresses in the living room. We spent the night there, hearing noises from the wind in the cracks, until, in the early morning, I woke up with a very sharp pain in my head. I opened my eyes and thought I saw a figure pass through the door that led to the backyard. I'm not sure. I blinked several times, but my vision was blurry. My body felt heavy. The next day, I woke up with a fever. Rebecca and Iris were worried, but there wasn't much to do besides rest. In this fragile condition, I remembered Silas's notebook. I asked my mother to bring it to me, and there, leafing through, I found a last blank page except for a small reddish stain. That made my heart race. Iris approached, asked if I was okay. I couldn't answer. I closed the notebook, feeling a shiver that I couldn't explain in a logical way. That same afternoon, we decided to leave once more, but something happened before. When we were trying to cross the yard to call a vehicle, I stumbled and ended up falling among dry branches. I remained unconscious for longer than I imagined. Maybe 30 minutes, I'm not sure. Upon coming to, I realized I was alone in a corner of the terrain, about 20 steps from the house. I didn't see my mother or my sister. I shouted their names. No one responded. I ran into the empty house, went through the backyard. Nothing. I walked to the road, looking for any sign of the two. Suddenly, I came across tire marks imprinted in the soft soil, something that wasn't there before. In the background, there was a man standing next to a tree. He had a tense posture, but I couldn't see his face in detail. When I tried to approach, I felt a chill throughout my body, as if my legs weighed a ton. Not knowing what to do, I returned to the house and sat on the living room floor. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't have a phone available. I stayed there motionless for a long time. Night fell and I was still alone. No sign of Rebecca or Iris. I spent the hours without sleeping, sitting near the door, waiting for them to appear. At some point, I dozed off. I dreamed of Silas. He looked at me with the same cold expression from the end of his life. I woke up startled, sweating, and realized the house was as silent as before. I tried to get up, but I felt a sudden weakness. I needed water, needed air. I forced my body and managed to stand. I crossed the yard toward the road. Everything was dark, no light in sight, just the wind. I walked for about half an hour, trying to find someone or some clue, but nothing. With no alternatives, I returned to the house, took a little water from an old filter, and leaned against the wall. I had the impression that I was trapped in an inevitable fate. I don't know if that was a real consequence of a macabre contract or pure paranoia, but I couldn't rid myself of the feeling that the agreement made by Silas had hit me hard. At the beginning of the morning, I decided to walk back to the main road in search of help. I walked without knowing exactly where to go, calling the names of my mother and my sister. No response. After a few minutes, I realized I was carrying Silas's notebook in my backpack. I stopped and opened it. I came across that blank page that now had an almost invisible handwriting, as if someone had written very lightly the phrase, "The heir has already been chosen." I wanted to believe I was seeing things, but the phrase seemed real. I tore up the page, threw the pieces in a ditch, and continued. Along the way, I talked to myself. I won't accept this, but who was I talking to? I still don't know where my mother and my sister disappeared to. They would never fail to warn me if they were safe somewhere. As for me, I feel every day the same exhaustion of Silas in his last times. My legs fail, my head throbs, and I don't find anyone who believes what I report. It's been several weeks that I've been wandering, saving money from odd jobs I do, sleeping in rooms rented for 1 or 2 nights. Sometimes I think that if Silas entered a dangerous game, perhaps all that's left for me is to deal with the consequences until the end of my life. And despite everything, I still have a glimmer of hope that somewhere Rebecca and Iris are waiting for me, free from this plot that my father started. Deep down, I've already understood that this story doesn't end with the death of whoever signs the contract. It continues. It pursues anyone who carries the same blood. I still don't know if they believe me when I tell this. I just know that wherever I go, the past comes back to find me, and I continue in darkness with no certain date to get out of it. My name is Martin, and I worked for most of my life as a caretaker in a cemetery in northern Minnesota. I always approached everything practically, taking care of the graves, digging new ones when necessary, keeping the place clean and organized. I never had much patience for ghost stories. I believed that death was just a natural cycle, and didn't think that the deceased could cause problems. This mindset accompanied me for more than 20 years, but there was something I still didn't know. Silent rituals can leave strong echoes, especially in a place where silence is already the norm. I used to arrive early, right after dawn, to organize the tasks. The routine was almost always the same. I arranged the tools, checked if anyone had left flowers scattered along the corridors, verified that no animals might damage any headstone. At night, I locked the gate and did a quick patrol before leaving. Most days passed without major surprises. At most, I'd find a visitor who got lost among the ancient graves or stopped to chat. Everything began to change when there was a burial that, at first, didn't seem so different from the others. The deceased was named Marcus, an older man known for being a specialist in ancient prayers. They said he dealt with prayers that went beyond the traditional ones, involved herbs, smudging, and things I never sought to understand properly. He had lived in the region for decades, but rarely appeared in public. Some residents said he had a reputation as a healer, and that he accepted offering his prayers to solve health problems or attract good luck. At first, I thought his funeral would follow the pattern: wake, farewell from family members, and then the burial. But when the family arrived, I was intrigued by the way they were all dressed. Instead of the usual black, they wore light, somewhat flowing clothes and didn't exchange a single word among themselves. I observed from a distance as they placed the coffin in a corner, covered by an improvised tarp, even before going to the grave. I noticed that no relative was crying, but rather maintained a very serious expression, as if they were expecting something. I couldn't tell if it was contained sadness or some kind of ritual. When the time came to take the coffin to the grave, this group gathered in a semicircle around the tomb I had dug early that morning. They maintained total silence for a few moments. Then a tall man, who seemed to be Marcus's brother, began to chant softly without instruments. I didn't understand the words, but I felt it wasn't a common prayer. One or another family member placed small objects on the coffin: dried leaves, bead amulets, and colored candles. Everything was arranged with certain care. I stood a few meters away, waiting for the moment to cover the grave. But there was something unsettling about that ceremony. It wasn't noisy or spectacular, but precisely because it was so contained, it seemed to carry an energy that made me uncomfortable. Once they finished, the tall man looked at me and made a gesture with his head, indicating that I could begin to cover the grave. They left the objects there around the coffin. No one collected anything. I threw the first shovelful of dirt without looking too much at what I was burying along with it. But I felt that it wasn't common: lit candles, leaves that exhaled some kind of different smell. When I finally finished the job, they grouped together again and left in a line without exchanging a single word with me. Something in the air seemed denser than normal, but I convinced myself it was just an impression. That night I returned home and tried to forget about it. I had had a laborious day since the cemetery was full of scattered flowers due to a previous celebration, and I needed to organize everything before closing. But sleeping wasn't so simple. I kept tossing in bed, thinking about the way that family had behaved. It wasn't exactly frightening, but it left a strange sensation, as if something had remained incomplete. The next morning, I arrived at the cemetery with a discomfort I couldn't quite explain. As I opened the gate, I noticed there was a strong aroma of burned herbs, almost as if someone had done a smudging rite there in the middle of the night. I checked around and found nothing out of place. Then I attributed the smell to some resident who might have passed by with incense. I went straight to the site where Marcus had been buried. I was surprised to see the candles outside the grave again, lit. To my confusion, they were stuck in the ground, arranged almost in a circle, and the dried leaves that I remembered burying were once again scattered as if they had been removed from there. I stood still, not knowing what to think. I had seen everything being covered with dirt myself. I decided to collect everything, as my job was to keep the cemetery in order. I gathered the candles, which remained lit, although they seemed burned only halfway, and collected the leaves that were still whole even after having been buried. I threw everything in a bucket and took it to the incinerator in the back, where we usually burn old flowers or remains from exhumations. I didn't worry about commenting to anyone at that moment. I always worked alone in the morning, and only later did my colleague Derek arrive. The day went on within normality. At nightfall, as usual, I went to do the last patrol before closing the cemetery. I passed through the corridors, checked if any side gate was open, and ended up near Marcus's grave. Something caught my attention. There was a dark mark on the earth, as if someone had spilled some liquid on top. I got closer and smelled a scent similar to the burned leaves from the morning, but even stronger. I don't know why, but my first reaction was to turn my back and quicken my pace. I locked the gate and went on my way home, trying not to give it importance. However, the memory of that stain remained in my head. That night I had a restless sleep. I woke up several times feeling a strange affliction, almost as if I had a fever, but my forehead was dry. I got up, drank water, and tried to calm myself. I thought about turning on the TV to distract my mind, but preferred to remain in the dark, forcing my body to rest. When the day dawned, I went to work with a tired face, but determined to ignore any idea of an abnormal phenomenon. As soon as I entered the cemetery, I went straight to Marcus's grave. My impulse was to check if things were in place. When I got there, I saw that someone had left a wreath of white flowers arranged in a half-moon, forming a path that pointed to the headstone. There was no sign of footprints in the earth, nothing to indicate where this person had passed. Of course, people usually visit graves of loved ones, but his relatives didn't seem to be the type who would do something so discreet. And that specific arrangement caused me an uneasiness difficult to explain. It seemed like a symbol. In the middle of the flowers, I found an embroidered cloth with golden threads, rolled up as if it were a small bundle. I opened it carefully and noticed there was a dark powder inside. It didn't smell like anything I knew. Imagining it was just another kind of offering or ritual, I took it and stored it in a plastic bag to throw away later. I tried to continue my day normally, but around 11 in the morning, when Derek arrived, he noticed my serious expression. "You look kind of worn out, Martin." "Something wrong?" Derek is younger than me and usually takes everything as a joke. But at that moment, he seemed genuinely concerned. I don't know if I can call it wrong, but strange things have been happening at the new grave, the one for Marcus. He frowned as if trying to remember. "That's the gentleman who worked with different prayers, isn't it?" I told Derek what I had seen. The candles relighting, the leaves returning to the surface, the flowers that appeared without explanation. He didn't laugh or joke, which surprised me. He looked at me seriously and just said, "Some people used to comment that he knew things that go beyond limits. Maybe it's better not to mess with what they leave for him. You know how it is. When we meddle with what we don't understand, the consequences can be strange." I confess that at the time, I felt a certain relief in talking to someone about it, but I also became concerned about feeding into mysticism. I never believed much in manifestations beyond what could be explained. Still, the coincidences left me intrigued. Around 5 in the afternoon, I decided to go to the church near the square and talk with Father Anderson. He already knew me because of other burials, and when he received me, he noticed my state of nervousness. "What happened, Martin?" I explained what was going on, trying not to sound exaggerated. He listened in silence with a concentrated look, and in the end, he said that sometimes when a person gets involved with older prayers, they can leave spiritual charges that manifest in subtle ways. He advised me to maintain respect for the objects that were left at the grave and to pray for Marcus, asking that he find peace. I found that a bit vague, but accepted the recommendation. I returned to the cemetery the next day with the idea of leaving the offerings where they were. If something new appeared, I wouldn't touch it. Around 8 o'clock, during my inspection, I noticed that besides the white flowers from the previous day, someone had placed 2 more colored candles, the same type I saw at the burial, and some small ceramic pieces painted with symbols I didn't recognize. I approached, but didn't have the courage to collect anything. I remembered Derek's and Father Anderson's advice. I left everything there and continued my routine. The dawn of that day was particularly silent. I stayed at the cemetery later because I needed to check a wall that had started to crack near the older tombs. While circulating, I had the impression of hearing footsteps. They seemed light, dragging, but they didn't repeat after I stopped to listen carefully. I decided to take a complete tour of the corridors. Everything was empty. Perhaps it was the wind moving the branches of the trees, or some cat circulating around. Even so, the atmosphere seemed different, almost as if that corner was isolated from the rest of the world. I didn't see anything concrete and preferred not to feed my imagination. I closed the cemetery around 9 at night and went home. In the following days, the offerings continued to appear. Small candles, sculptures, folded papers with phrases I couldn't decipher. Nothing that would frighten me, but the constant repetition of that began to bother me. I asked around town if anyone saw any of Marcus's relatives entering the cemetery late, but no one could inform me. They commented that his relatives had left right after the funeral, taking everything that was in his house. One afternoon, while making small repairs to the painting on the graves, I noticed that there was a moist stain of a reddish color in the exact place where Marcus's coffin was buried. It seemed that the soil was soaked by some liquid that wasn't just water. I touched it lightly with the brush, but didn't smell a metallic odor or anything similar. Just a bitter smell that reminded me of macerated herbs. I threw some soil on top to cover the stain. Derek, who was nearby, saw my expression of bewilderment, but didn't question me at the time. It was only at the end of the day that he approached me. That gentleman left more than memories, didn't he? Today in the afternoon, I found a piece of cloth tied to a tree branch, with some symbols kind of scribbled on it. Do you think people are performing some ritual or offering something to him? I, who already didn't know what to think, shook my head. I don't know what's going on, but I think we shouldn't mess with this. Let's just keep things clean where we can and leave these things as they are. He agreed. Still, that conversation left me disturbed. The idea of nocturnal rituals, or people entering the cemetery, without authorization took away my peace. I always thought that if something out of the ordinary happened, there would be a clearer indication. But everything there was too subtle. One night, I decided to hide behind the small tool shed until later, imagining that if someone really entered after hours, I could catch them and discover once and for all who it was. I did my normal shift, locked the gate, and turned off the lights. But I made sure to leave a small gap so I could see the movement in the main corridor. I waited until around 10 at night. Everything was calm, without any noise. Now and then, I heard the croaking of frogs in the distance, but nothing beyond that. When I was tired, I thought about going back home, but a small flash of light caught my attention from the other side of the cemetery, in the direction of Marcus's grave. I got up slowly and followed behind the mausoleums, stepping carefully to not make noise. When I got close, I noticed that the brightness came from a candle that someone had lit inside a transparent glass. The glass protected the flame from the wind, but I didn't see anyone there. I looked around and didn't find signs of people. No shadow, no figure. Just that lit candle as if it had appeared out of nowhere. I extinguished the candle, but upon doing so, I had an intense feeling of discomfort. The air seemed still heavy, although I can't explain why. I left the glass on the ground and decided to return the next day to take care of it. When I got home, I couldn't stop remembering the image of that candle inside the flask. It was just a candle, something so common in cemeteries. But at the same time, it disturbed me that it had appeared without me seeing anyone. At this point, I was already exhausted from trying to rationalize each event. There was a constant weight on my back, as if I worked day and night without a break. I ended up falling asleep with the TV on, something I rarely do, seeking a bit of distraction. The next day, I told Derek what had happened. He looked at me with a mixture of concern and seriousness and suggested, "Why don't we talk to the priest again? Maybe he has another guidance." We went to the church after lunch. Father Anderson received us in a room next to the sacristy and listened patiently. When we finished, he took a deep breath. Perhaps what's happening isn't properly something from Marcus, but rather what he left in life. Some people follow ancient practices, and when they depart, there are those who continue worshiping that memory. It could be a way of keeping alive a promise, a debt, or something we don't know about. You should be careful not to interrupt a process that might be important to these people. He suggested that we perform a prayer at the site, asking that any spirit or energy present there calm down. I don't consider myself a very religious man, but I was willing to try anything that would bring a bit of peace. So at dusk, Derek and I went to Marcus's grave, brought a small pot with holy water and prayed. It wasn't an elaborate ritual, just a few words of good intention and a gesture of respect. We concluded and returned to our tasks. For a few days, it seemed to have an effect. No new candles, no strange offerings, no different odors. The calm, however, didn't last long. A week later, when we were already relieved, something happened that concerned me much more. As soon as I arrived at the cemetery, I found the gate ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before. The lock wasn't forced or damaged. I looked around and didn't notice anything broken or out of place. But as I approached Marcus's grave, I noticed that the earth seemed disturbed, as if someone had dug there. The headstone remained in the same place, but there were marks of a shovel or a hoe about 1/2 meter deep. It seemed that the person had started to unearth the coffin and given up halfway. I tried to understand if that was the work of vandals or something related to a ritual. The earth was loose, but you couldn't see inside the grave. I began to replace it with my shovel, feeling a strong anxiety. Derek arrived an hour later and found me nervous, sweating, trying to leave everything as it was before. He widened his eyes. "Who would do this? I don't know, but it's not normal. I'm going to install an extra padlock on the gate, and I think we should consider putting some lock on the inside part too." He agreed. I spent the day with a feeling that we were witnessing something serious. At night, I didn't have the courage to stay there alone to keep watch. I closed the cemetery and reinforced the gate. I tied an extra chain, but I went home tormented. Arriving home, I couldn't eat properly. The idea of someone having tried to exhume Marcus without authorization left me restless. The next morning, I decided to speak again with Father Anderson and explain the situation. He was concerned and offered help to talk with the local authorities. But we didn't have proof of a crime, just signs of possible vandalism. However, deep down, I suspected it wasn't just common vandalism. It seemed to have a purpose, something connected to that strange devotion that some people nurtured for Marcus. Time passed, and the occurrences decreased. No one else tried to dig up the grave, but the small offerings continued to appear in a more subtle way. Sometimes we would find a vase with sprigs of rue. Other times a clay pot painted with designs that resembled mixed religious symbols. At a certain point, I preferred to stop worrying. I focused on keeping the cemetery clean, warning Derek not to throw away the things that appeared on Marcus's tomb. He complied somewhat reluctantly, but understood it was better to avoid conflicts. Even with this apparent truce, there were still nights when I slept poorly. It was as if a part of me was always alert. I began to have confused dreams in which I walked through the corridors of the cemetery and found an elderly gentleman in light clothes standing in front of the grave. He didn't say anything, just raised his hand in my direction. I would wake up with my heart racing, not remembering details, but with the image of that gesture clear in my mind. I tried to face all this as a result of stress. Derek, on the other hand, didn't show major concerns, but I began to notice that he avoided doing the night patrols. He always found some excuse to leave before sunset. I didn't judge him because I myself didn't feel comfortable staying there after dark. Despite everything, our routine moved forward without major events until one afternoon. A woman appeared at the cemetery with a very troubled semblance. She said she was Marcus's daughter and lived in another region. She came looking for something her father had left. She spoke to me without beating around the bush. My father kept the writings that belonged to our family, things about prayer and herb preparation. I need them. I replied that I hadn't seen anything in his house because I never entered there. But she insisted. He might have buried them with the body, or then someone brought them here on the day of the wake. If you know anything, let me know. I approached the grave accompanied by her. I explained that I couldn't authorize the opening of the tomb without a legal procedure. The woman seemed frustrated, but didn't insist. She just asked me to call if I discovered any sign of the said writings. I asked if she had any idea who might be leaving offerings. She sighed. Probably people my father helped in life and who follow certain traditions. He wasn't a simple prayer man. There were those who considered him a channel of blessings. Perhaps some still try to maintain spiritual contact with him. As soon as she left, I felt that those offerings made more sense. They were demonstrations of respect or payment of promises. After all, if Marcus really performed cures or protection rituals, it's likely that many people believe in his power even after death. The weeks passed, and the cemetery returned to being the tranquil place it was before, with the exception of the offerings that continued to appear. Since we no longer collected them, they accumulated, but without causing mess. They were flowers, candles, small objects made of wood or fabric. Nothing that would bring confusion. Derek became more relaxed, and so did I, although I still had my fears about the nocturnal appearances. The woman, Marcus's daughter, never returned. Life went on, until one night, I needed to stay later because of a burial scheduled at the last minute. When I finished everything, it was already past 8 o'clock. I turned off the lights and was preparing to close the gate. But I heard a murmur, almost like a soft litany, coming from the back of the cemetery. I called Derek's name, but he had already gone home long ago. I thought about pretending I hadn't heard, but curiosity spoke louder. I crossed the central corridor and headed to the place of origin of that sound. When I got near Marcus's grave, I identified a kneeling figure with a head bowed. It was someone who wore a black scarf on the head, appearing to be an elderly person. I stopped a few meters away, trying to understand what the person was saying. Before I could say anything, the figure stood up calmly. I didn't get to see the face clearly because the lighting was very dim, but I noticed that she held a rosary and a lit candle in the other hand. Sorry to bother you, but the cemetery is about to close. The person slightly tilted her head toward me, as if asking permission, and left without saying anything. I was left without reaction. She left the candle on the ground, next to the grave, still lit. For a moment, I had the urge to extinguish the candle, but something in me said not to mess with that small flame. I returned slowly, reflecting on what I had just witnessed. That person didn't seem threatening, but the whole scene was at least strange. The next day, I found the candle exactly where it was. It had consumed almost all of itself, but hadn't left any drop of wax spread. It seemed intact, as if it had stopped in time. I did the patrol without touching anything. When I told what happened to Father Anderson, he just commented, "Sometimes people have their own rituals to honor those who did them some good. I don't think it does any harm to keep that candle there if it's not harming anyone." I agreed, despite remaining with doubts. After all, I didn't understand why Marcus still attracted so many mysterious visits, but it became clear to me that not everything had to be understood. The cemetery continued to be a place of farewells and memories, some more silent than others. With the passing of months, I received sporadic reports from people who, when visiting relatives, noticed strange movements around Marcus's grave. Never anything violent, just murmurs, candles, flowers that appeared and disappeared. It seemed that the routine of these worshippers, or grateful ones, continued firm, even without belonging to an organized group. I realized it wasn't something I needed to combat, as long as the place remained respected. These days, I'm not as skeptical as before. I still don't believe in ghosts the way movies portray them. But I learned that there are cults and prayers that can mess with people's minds, and perhaps in a way, with the environment around them. I don't need scientific evidence to understand that some phenomena are deeper than my convictions. I continue opening the cemetery every day, organizing headstones, sweeping dry leaves. But whenever I pass by Marcus's grave, I maintain a certain distance, not out of fear, but out of respect. His life may have been surrounded by enigmas, and it's not up to me to try to solve what doesn't belong to me. I still occasionally receive a visit from someone who seeks something related to the deceased. The conversations generally don't lead anywhere, as I can say little. I just advise that they respect the space, and if they want to leave their objects, they can leave them. As long as it doesn't destroy anything, I see no reason to prohibit it. Derek also adapted. He got used to seeing small candles flickering on moonless nights, and sometimes just comments to me, "It's another common night, isn't it?" I agree, because now I understand that the cemetery is like a cauldron of memories, and some people still need to keep alive the flame of those who have departed. Be it superstition, devotion, or remembrance, whatever it is, it's human. I no longer fear staying there after nightfall, although I avoid prolonging my stay too much. If there really are different presences roaming that piece of land, they seem linked to an act of faith or gratitude, not violence. Marcus's headstone still receives white flowers almost every week, and one or another colored candle lights, without anyone assuming authorship. It seems he is still cherished by those who knew him closely or benefited from his prayers. I know this account may sound strange, but it's what I experienced. There were no loud noises or scenes worthy of a horror movie. Just small signs that the dead can remain influential in the lives of those who stay, especially when they carry stories that don't end with the last breath. If someone asks me if I believe in hauntings, I'll say I'm not sure, but that I respect what I don't understand. And if one day you visit a cemetery and find a lit candle in an unusual place, don't be frightened. Perhaps it's just a reminder that some farewells continue, even when we're no longer looking. When you work with people, especially in situations as unique as a flight, you learn that nothing is truly predictable. It's in these moments that the unexpected finds us, completely changing the meaning of an ordinary day. This story is about one of those moments, something I experienced that still makes me reflect to this day. For 15 years, I worked as a flight attendant for two airlines that are now defunct, Skypath and Western Continental. It was at Skypath in 2011 that I had a profound experience when I had only been in the profession for 11 months. This particular flight had something unusual about it from the beginning, and I believe it was due to its special nature. The captain informed us during the briefing that the cargo compartment would be transporting several caskets. These were people who had tragically lost their lives trying to cross from the Arizona desert into California, either from the harsh conditions of the journey or from even more heartbreaking circumstances. At boarding time, as expected, the atmosphere on board was heavy. There were many faces marked by grief, tears flowing, people trying to console each other. In the galley, we were organizing the service items, adjusting meals in the oven, when a man approached quietly. He wore simple clothes typical of a rural worker, boots, and a weathered hat. With a gentle tone, he asked if it would be possible to bring a glass of water to his wife, who was sitting in the back, as she needed to take some medication. I promptly offered to help. I took the water, and as I walked down the aisle, I saw the man entering the restroom. When I reached the indicated row, I found the woman sitting there, clearly distressed. Her face showed the same sadness that so many others were carrying that day. As I approached, I asked, "Ma'am, did you ask for water to take your medicine?" Surprised, she looked at me for a moment before responding, almost whispering, "Yes, I need to take my medication, but I didn't ask for water." I chose not to insist, thinking perhaps she was confused by the situation. I asked if she was feeling all right, and she merely nodded. To reassure her, I commented, "Don't worry, we'll be starting the meal service soon, so you can eat something and avoid taking your medicine on an empty stomach." I returned to the galley and saw the man coming out of the restroom. I informed him that we were about to begin the service and suggested he return to his seat with his wife. He thanked me and walked away. During the flight, as we collected the trays, he returned to the back to thank us again and ask how much longer until we reached Portland. I told him it would be about 2 hours, and he thanked me once more before entering the restroom. However, after that moment, I didn't notice the man's presence again. When we initiated the descent procedures and checked the cabin, I noticed that the woman still had an untouched tray beside her. "Is your husband in the restroom?" I asked. "I need to collect the tray." With a confused look, she responded, "My husband." I explained that the man had asked for water for her and told me he was her husband. Trying to clarify, I added, "He mentioned he was your spouse and was the one who asked for water so you could take your medicine." With trembling hands, she took out a small rosary and a photo from her purse, showing it to me. "Is this the gentleman?" she asked, her eyes already welling up with tears. I looked at the image, and without a doubt, it was the same man. I confirmed with a nod, and she, through tears, explained, "He does indeed accompany me, but he's not sitting here with me. He's down below in the cargo hold, inside a casket. My husband suffered an accident trying to cross the border near Yuma, and I'm bringing his body home." Her words left me speechless, filled with an emotion that I carry with me to this day. I felt a chill run up my spine, still processing what I had just heard. I offered my condolences to the woman and carefully asked if I could keep the photo for a few minutes to show my colleague. I explained briefly what had happened, and she, with a gentle gesture, allowed it. I thanked her and promised to return it as soon as we landed, as we were already in the descent phase. With the photo in hand, I returned to the galley and told everything to my fellow crew member, who had also seen the man when he asked us for water. When I showed him the photo, his face changed immediately. He looked at me fixedly and said, "Don't joke about this now. You won't believe it, but I saw this man not only when he asked for water. He was talking with another young man earlier during the coffee service. My curiosity turned into a mix of disbelief and apprehension. "What do you mean?" I asked. He continued, "I saw them both sitting, talking while we were passing through the rows. But then I didn't see the other young man anymore. I walked by several times, and that seat was empty. Didn't you see the two of them together?" I responded that no, I had only seen the man, the woman's husband. He then, visibly shaken, commented, "I'm certain that the other young man is also down below in the cargo hold." The atmosphere between us grew heavy, a silence that seemed even denser within that cramped space. As soon as we landed, I returned the photo to the woman, maintaining a warm tone and trying to bring some comfort. "Look, your husband is still taking care of you. Tell him he can rest peacefully now because you're both finally home." That evening, after the passengers had disembarked and we were preparing the aircraft for the next flight, we passed through the cargo area. The caskets were being offloaded with solemn respect. I found myself staring at them, wondering which one contained the man I had served water to just hours earlier. My colleague seemed to read my thoughts. "I've been flying for 22 years, he said quietly. "And there are things that happen in this job that simply defy explanation. The skies hold more mysteries than we can comprehend. To this day, I sometimes wonder if the man's spirit was just making one final journey with his wife, or if there was something more profound at work. I've never experienced anything like it since, but I've learned that the line between our world and whatever comes after might be thinner than we imagine, especially at 35,000 feet. I landed this job opportunity through a close friend who worked as an operator in the departments responsible for distributing products at this company. I started as a warehouse associate in a small facility that distributed specialty foods for a regional brand in upstate New York. For 4 months, I worked peacefully on the morning shift without any unusual situations. It was only after a staff reduction that things began to change. My 2 colleagues and I were assigned to complete an inventory count after hours. Fortunately, it was just a specific section, not the entire stock, and we were dealing with various supplies, not the main products of the company. We finished the task around 9 in the evening, and were waiting for a colleague to finalize the documentation filing. We were in an area with industrial refrigerators when something unusual suddenly happened. Only my coworker and I were there when we heard a loud bang on one of the freezer doors. We turned toward the sound but saw no one. We thought it might be our other colleague, but then we heard his voice coming from another direction, asking if we were ready to leave. That's when we both exchanged confused looks, and without warning, we saw 2 freezer doors slowly open and then slam shut with a thunderous noise. We didn't think twice. We ran toward the main entrance. There we found our colleague who laughed at our reaction and asked if we had gotten scared. We told him what had happened, and he, having worked there for about 2 years or a bit more, reassured us. "Don't worry, we're outside now. Nothing's going to happen to us. But didn't anyone tell you that strange things happen here at night?" We responded that no. This was our first time staying at the location after normal hours, and we had never heard anything like it. That's when he explained. "The night watchman told me they're not ghosts or spirits. Nothing like apparitions, he said. He believes that when these things happen, it's because early in the morning, the witches come to stock up. He never told me who they are, but he claims to know them and just keeps his distance without interfering. I've experienced strange things myself, our colleague continued. Doors opening and closing, objects falling, bags of sausages being thrown even when no one was in sight. The next day, the watchman always tells me he saw the witches shopping as if they were regular customers, but he never reveals who they are. He finished by telling us that despite the stories, the security protocol made it clear that he only locked the doors at the end of the workday without returning to the internal area. That was the last time I had to stay that late in that place. I worked there for more time, and I can confirm that on several occasions, when talking with the night watchman in the early morning hours, he repeated the same story. The witches appeared early to do their shopping. However, he never revealed who they were. What intrigued me is that, regardless of any belief, we really did see those doors moving by themselves. That's a fact I cannot deny. Fortunately, with some changes made by the company, I never had to work at night again. The following week, I arrived early one morning, earlier than usual. The facility was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigeration units. I spotted the night watchman making his final rounds before clocking out. Curiosity got the better of me. About those witches, I ventured. Are they actual customers during the day? The old man stopped, his weathered face unreadable in the dim light. Son, some things are better left unquestioned, he said slowly. But I'll tell you this, they've been coming here since long before this was a food distributor. This land has history. He glanced around nervously before continuing in a lower voice. Back in the 60s, before all this development, there was a small community here. Practiced old ways, kept to themselves. The company bulldozed their meeting site to build this warehouse. Some say they never left. So they're ghosts? I asked skeptically. He shook his head. No, not ghosts. Something different. They still breathe, still walk among us during daylight. But they remember, and they claim what was theirs at night. Why don't they cause any real damage then? I pressed. A strange smile crossed his face. Who says they don't? Check the company's financial records every winter solstice. Inventory discrepancies, unexplained losses. Management blames it on accounting errors, but I know better. He tapped his temple. The witches take their due, just not in ways most people notice. 2 weeks later, I was transferred to the morning shift permanently. I never stayed late again, and I never saw those doors move by themselves. But sometimes, when I'd arrive early and the warehouse was still dark, I'd feel eyes watching from between the tall shelves. And occasionally, I'd find small, peculiar arrangements of dried herbs and twisted wire hidden behind boxes. Little symbols that no one would claim responsibility for placing there. I left that job 3 years ago, but I still drive by the facility occasionally. Last December, I noticed they were finally tearing the old place down. The night watchman, now retired, stood across the street watching the demolition. When he saw me, he just nodded knowingly. They're building a shopping center, he said without greeting. Won't make a difference though. Some visitors don't need an invitation to come shopping after hours. During last autumn, I moved to a house in a completely new town. Before that, I had only passed through once for a job interview. When I was hired, I had to make the move in a hurry. It was an important opportunity for my career, so I did my best to make everything go as planned. The town, however, was quite isolated, which made the entire moving process more complicated. I ended up renting a house over the internet, even knowing it wasn't the ideal way to do it. I figured that since it was a 1-year contract, I could look for something better later if necessary. On the first day of November, I loaded all my belongings into my pickup truck and hit the road. I only stopped to refuel, but still arrived at my destination close to 9 at night. I remember that the only time I had been there, I had visited during the day, so seeing the town at night was quite different. The street lighting was weak, most stores were closed, and because of this, the place seemed deserted. For someone coming from a larger city like me, it caused a certain discomfort. There were no other cars on the road, and for a few moments, I had the sensation of driving through an abandoned place. Shortly after, I arrived at the neighborhood where my new house was located. It was a modest construction surrounded by others very similar to it, all in a row. I parked in the driveway and grabbed my inflatable mattress, since I had sold almost everything before moving, planning to furnish the place little by little. As soon as I entered, I realized the house was exactly what I expected. Old, with wooden floors that creaked with each step, and a slight smell of mildew. The layout was simple: a kitchen connected to the living room, and a long corridor leading to 2 bedrooms. After taking a quick tour of the place, I turned off the lights and went straight to the main bedroom. I placed the mattress on the floor and began to inflate it with the electric pump. I sat on the floor, completely exhausted after hours on the road and all the stress of moving. While I was sitting there trying to rest a bit, I heard a noise coming from the other side of the house. It was a small but very clear creak, like the sound of a floorboard being stepped on. My first thought was that perhaps it was some animal, like a raccoon, that had entered the house before I arrived. I got up and walked down the corridor toward the living room to investigate. I didn't even bother turning on the lights, just looked around in the dark. The living room was the same as before, completely empty, and there was no sign of anything or anyone. I took a deep breath and concluded that I was probably imagining things, a result of fatigue and stress. After all, I still didn't know the natural sounds of that old house. I returned to the bedroom. The mattress was already full, so I stretched a blanket over it and lay down. I knew the next day would be full of tasks, and I needed to rest as much as possible. Despite the simplicity of the environment and all the strangeness of that first night, I fell asleep quickly as soon as I rested my head. I woke up to absolute darkness around me, as if my eyes were still closed. Everything was so dark it was impossible to distinguish anything. From the silence and the sense of time, I imagined it must be the middle of the night. I tried to relax and go back to sleep, but I was interrupted by a noise right in front of me, the distinct sound of a floorboard creaking. In an instant, my eyes opened again, and I sat up abruptly. I stared in the direction of the sound, but couldn't see anything. I remained motionless, hearing only the sound of my heart beating strongly, while a growing discomfort took over me. Suddenly, another creak echoed, now coming from a position more to the left. Panic began to set in. My mind wavered between believing this was a nightmare and accepting that it was really happening. Before I could decide, a sequence of 4 creaks resonated, each coming from a different point, as if someone was moving around the room in the darkness. Amid the darkness, I had the impression of seeing a slight silhouette. My body tensed, and then the bedroom door was abruptly opened. The moonlight from the corridor briefly illuminated the figure of a man, quickly passing from my field of vision. I heard his steps running to the other end of the house as I hurried to turn on the lights. As soon as I reached the switch, I realized that the front door was completely open. In the brief moment that I observed the figure, I could tell he appeared to be around 40 years old, wore worn clothes, and was wearing boots. I couldn't capture more details. Without hesitation, I grabbed my cell phone and keys, left the house, and got into my truck. As I drove, I called the local police and reported what had happened. From what I explained, the officers concluded that someone was probably occupying the house while it was vacant. However, that didn't explain why he was in my room, and worse, crawling around while I slept. Thankfully, the landlord was understanding and allowed me to terminate the rental contract. Within a short time, I moved to another place. To this day, I wonder what could have happened if I hadn't woken up that night. The thought still sends chills down my spine. But the story doesn't end there. 2 months after moving to a small apartment in the center of town, I was having coffee at a local diner when I overheard a conversation at the next table. 2 elderly men were discussing local history, specifically about a farmhouse that had been converted into rentals, my former residence. "Shame what they did with the old Wakefield place," one of them said, stirring his coffee slowly. "Breaking it up into those cheap rentals. Don't think anyone stays there long anyway," the other replied. "Not with its history." I couldn't help but interrupt. "Excuse me," I said, turning to them. "I actually rented there briefly." "What history are you referring to?" The men exchanged knowing glances. The taller one, with a gray mustache, leaned toward me. "Back in '72, a family of 4 lived in that house, the Madisons. Father had some mental problems, started believing his family was being replaced by imposters. One night he drew his finger across his throat. That's terrible, I whispered, feeling a chill despite the warm diner. Thing is, the other man continued, he was never caught. Some say he still returns to that house, crawling around at night, checking to see if the imposters have returned. I must have gone pale because they both stopped talking and looked concerned. You all right, son? The mustached man asked. I nodded mechanically. When did you say this happened? 1972, that's right. April 14th, 1972. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and checked the calendar. The night of my encounter had been November 14th, exactly 45 years to the day from when the murders were discovered. As I paid my bill and hurried out of the diner, the mustached man called after me. There's one more thing. They say he only returns on the 14th of each month. Always checking, always crawling. I never returned to that town. I found another job in another state, and I never again rented a place without thoroughly researching its history first. And to this day, on the 14th of every month, I make sure I'm not alone after midnight. When I was younger, I was assigned the responsibility of working as a security guard on the midnight shift at an immense warehouse in the city of Milwaukee. The place was primarily dedicated to storage, with gigantic steel shelving units reaching almost to the ceiling. Our security team had the mission of patrolling different points of the building during the night, a task that involved a lot of walking during the shift. 2 guards were always scheduled, one to monitor the outside from the comfort of a car, and the other to patrol the interior on foot. It's not hard to guess which role was the most coveted. That Wednesday night, I had started my shift about 30 minutes earlier. My habit was to begin work by walking through the warehouse for an hour, inspecting the location before settling into one of the security offices. This space had a fairly rudimentary camera system by today's standards, but at the time it seemed quite advanced, comprised of just 2 screens and 2 cameras strategically installed, one in the northeast corner and another in the southwest corner. The system was so sparse that foot patrolling was indispensable. This warehouse served several technology companies, housing extremely expensive equipment, which justified the presence of 2 night guards every day. The internal layout was similar to a supermarket, with something between 10 and 15 corridors aligned, cut in the middle by a central corridor. While conducting the initial round, I noticed something unusual at the end of one of the corridors. A white form that vaguely resembled the outline of a head, seemingly peering from behind the last section of shelves. As it was distant, I could only distinguish that detail. I quickened my pace, going from a calm walk to something more hurried. When I reached the middle of the corridor, the white form disappeared behind a pile of boxes, making it clear that there was someone there inside. My heart raced with the confirmation that I wasn't alone. I hurried to the end of the corridor, perhaps expecting to find the other guard doing some kind of inspection. Already at the southwest corner of the warehouse, I looked at the camera positioned there, which was directed exactly to the spot where I had seen the figure. And there it was again in the 7th corridor, the same white form now closer with a clearer view. I realized it was a pale face, almost translucent and definitely frightening. But it wasn't the face of the other guard. It was something disturbing. Before I could react, the figure slowly disappeared, hiding once more behind the boxes. I called the other security guard on the radio, and he promptly responded that he was in the car parked in the back. He assured me he would come meet me in 5 minutes. After hanging up the phone, nervousness took over as I thought about returning to the corridor where I had seen that head. Despite knowing that this was a security guard's duty, one is never really prepared to deal with something so unexpected. I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and ran to the corridor. I reached the end and looked around, but there was no one in sight. I supposed the person had fled, so I advanced to the middle of the corridor, hoping to catch up with them. That's when a horrible and nauseating smell made me immediately stop. The odor was unbearable, as if coming from something decomposing. It smelled like a dead animal. I followed the trail of the smell, growing more intense, until I reached a large wooden box that stood out from the others around it. With hesitation, I lifted the lid of the box and was confronted with a sight I will never forget: the body of someone lying in a pool of blood. The most horrifying detail was that the head had been removed. Immediately, I grabbed the radio and called the other guard, shouting for him to call the police and report the discovery of a corpse in the warehouse. While doing this, I began to run desperately toward the back exit, trying to catch my breath, but my body was already in shock. As soon as I crossed the door, I was overwhelmed by an overwhelming nausea and ended up vomiting. Without thinking much, I ran to the other security guard's car and threw myself into the seat next to him, still breathless. He was on the phone with the police, but I took the device to provide the details that he hadn't been able to report. Given the seriousness of the situation, it didn't take long for 5 or 6 police cars to arrive, completely surrounding the warehouse. The police team removed the body in an ambulance, and the rest of the night was dedicated to forensic investigation. But what intrigued me the most was discovering later that the camera recordings had a gap of about 3 hours completely erased. There was no apparent reason for that failure. I spent years trying to understand what happened that night. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or supernatural things, but I simply can't find a plausible explanation for the events. Sometimes I think of absurd hypotheses, such as that the murderer could have been in the warehouse holding the victim's head, which would explain the pale and frightening appearance of the figure I saw. Just remembering it now, I feel chills running through my body. The case took a strange turn in the weeks that followed. The police investigation revealed the victim was a man named Curtis Lawson, a former employee who had been fired 6 months earlier for stealing warehouse inventory. The coroner determined he had been dead for less than 24 hours when I found him. What they couldn't explain was how the body had been placed in that particular box, in a high-security area, without triggering any alarms or being caught on the functioning cameras. Even stranger was that despite the gruesome decapitation, there was relatively little blood in the box itself, suggesting he had been killed elsewhere and moved to the warehouse. The head was never found. 3 weeks after my discovery, I was called to the police station to review my statement again. Detective Morales, a stern woman with prematurely gray hair, slid a folder across the table. "Mr. Jenkins," she said carefully, "we've analyzed all the camera footage that wasn't erased. There's something you should see." The footage showed the warehouse entrance at 6:14 that evening, 3 hours before my shift began. A man walked in using a valid keycard. Though the image was grainy, it was unmistakably Curtis Lawson, the same man whose headless body I had discovered later that night. "That's impossible," I stammered. "He was the victim." Detective Morales nodded grimly. "Yes, we've confirmed through multiple cameras that he entered the building alive at 6:14 p.m., used his old access code, which somehow still worked, and was never recorded leaving. But his employment was terminated months ago," I said. "His access should have been revoked." "It was," she replied. "The system logs confirm his credentials were deactivated the day he was fired. Yet somehow they worked that night." I felt a chill as I remembered the pale face I had seen. What about the other guard that night? Did his cameras pick up anything? Detective Morales exchanged glances with her partner. "That's another strange thing. He claims he never left the security vehicle that night until you called him after finding the body. But the exterior cameras show his car was empty from 11:27 to 12:44. I never returned to work at that warehouse. The case remains officially unsolved. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can smell that same decomposition odor, and I wonder, did I see Curtis Lawson's ghost wandering the warehouse, or was something else wearing his face that night? You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.